The foreman said a woman had no business on a roundup. She cut more calves than any hand. Mattie Sinclair rode into the Broken Spur ranch yard at 7 in the morning on a dun mare, with a rope coiled on the saddle horn, and her father's branding iron strapped to the cantle. She wore a split riding skirt, a man's canvas coat 2 sizes too large, and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low over her eyes. She was 26 years old, and she had been working cattle since she was 9. The yard was busy. A dozen men moved between the barn and the corrals, saddling horses, loading gear, preparing for the spring roundup that would take them into the high country for 2 weeks of branding, cutting, and sorting. The air smelled of horse sweat and leather, and the sharp tang of branding iron smoke from the forge, where a man was heating irons over a bed of coals. She found the foreman at the main corral. His name was Gage Pruitt, a squat, bow-legged man in his 50s, with a face like a clenched fist and a reputation for running the tightest roundup crew in the Sage Creek Valley. He was checking the cinch on a stocky gray horse when Mattie rode up and stopped 6 feet from the fence. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I'm here about the cutting position." He looked at her. He looked at her horse. He looked at her rope. Then he looked back at her with an expression that suggested she had just asked him to dance. "We don't hire women for roundup," he said. The notice at the mercantile didn't say that. The notice didn't say a lot of things. It also didn't say we hire one-legged men or children. Some things are understood. She did not flinch at his tone. She had heard it before. The particular inflection men used when they wanted to dismiss you without the effort of an argument. It was a sound as familiar to her as the creak of saddle leather. "I can cut cattle. I'm sure you think you can." "I don't think. I know. I've been cutting since I was 9. I worked my father's herd on the Laramie Range for 11 years before he died, and I worked the Custer Creek Roundup last spring as a fill-in when 2 of their hands quit." Pruitt looked at her with marginally more interest. "Who ran Custer Creek last spring?" "Art Devereaux. Art's a good man. He hired you knowing you were female?" "He hired me knowing I could rope. My being female was his problem, not mine." A small, involuntary twitch at the corner of Pruitt's mouth suggested something that was not quite amusement. He turned back to his horse. "Talk to the boss," he said. "It's his call, not mine." The boss was Rowan Beckett. Mattie found him on the porch of the ranch house, sitting in a straight-back chair with his right leg propped on a crate and a walking stick leaning against the railing beside him. He was 34, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and a face that would have been handsome if it were not so drawn, the hollowed cheeks and shadowed eyes of a man in chronic pain. He had broken his leg in 3 places the previous autumn when his horse rolled on him during a gather, and the bones had set badly. He could walk, but only with the stick, and riding was out of the question. He had built the Broken Spur from nothing, a quarter section of open range that he had claimed at 22 and expanded over 12 years into one of the strongest cattle operations in the valley. He had done it with his hands and his back, and an iron determination that the men who worked for him respected, even when they did not entirely like him. Now his hands and his back were useless below the waist, and the determination had curdled into something darker, a frustrated, simmering anger at his own body that he kept under control through sheer force of will. He looked up when Mattie climbed the porch steps. His eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man accustomed to reading livestock and people with equal precision. "Mr. Beckett," she said, "your foreman sent me. I'm looking for cutting work on the roundup." "He sent you because he didn't want to say no himself." Rowan shifted his leg on the crate and winced. "Gage doesn't like to be the bad guy. He prefers to let me do it." "Then do it," Mattie said. "Or don't. But decide before the crew rides out, because I'd rather not waste the morning." He studied her for a moment. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, at her directness, or recognition of a quality he understood. "What's your name?" "Mattie Sinclair. My father was Dale Sinclair, Laramie Range." "I knew Dale. Good cattleman." He paused. "He taught you." "Everything I know." "Can you rope from horseback at a gallop?" "Yes." "Can you cut a calf from a herd without scattering the bunch?" "Yes." "Can you work a branding fire without flinching?" "Mr. Beckett, I have burned myself on a branding iron more times than I've burned myself on a cook stove. I am not going to flinch." He almost smiled. Not quite. The pain in his leg pulled it back. But she saw the ghost of it. "1-week trial," he said. "Same pay as the other hands. If Pruitt says you can't keep up, you're done." Fair enough. The first day on the range was a war of silence. The crew, 11 men and Maddie, rode into the high country above Sage Creek at dawn, driving a loose gather of cattle ahead of them toward the branding ground. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody acknowledged her. She might as well have been invisible, except for the occasional sidelong glance that carried the unmistakable weight of disapproval. She rode at the back of the line and watched the country open up around her. The long sweep of sage-covered ridges, the dark stands of pine along the creek bottoms, the sky so vast and blue it made her chest ache. This was the landscape she understood. Not parlors, not kitchens, not the narrow confines of town life where women were expected to move in straight lines between the house and the church and the general store. Out here, the only thing that mattered was what you could do. And what Maddie could do was handle cattle with a precision that most men spent decades trying to achieve. She ignored the silence. She had spent her entire life being disapproved of. By school teachers who thought she should be learning needlework instead of roping. By neighbors who thought Dale Sinclair was ruining his daughter. By the endless procession of well-meaning women who told her she would never find a husband if she smelled like a horse. She had developed a tolerance for disapproval, the way some people develop a tolerance for altitude. Gradually, through sustained exposure, until it no longer affected her breathing. The cutting ground was a wide flat at the base of a ridge, with a holding pen built of juniper poles and a branding fire already burning when they arrived. Pruitt organized the crew with the crisp efficiency of a military operation. Ropers here, flankers there, branding men at the fire. He assigned Maddie to the cutting line without comment, which she understood as the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get. The work started at 9. The cattle were pushed into the holding pen in groups of 30, and the cutters rode in to separate calves from cows. A delicate, precise operation that required a horse with cow sense, a rider with timing, and the ability to read a calf's intentions before the calf knew them itself. Maddie's dun mare, Pepper, was a cutting horse of exceptional talent. Dale Sinclair had bred her from a line of quarter horses known for their agility, and Maddie had trained her from a foal. Not with the brutal methods some men used, but with patience and repetition and the kind of quiet, physical communication that existed between a rider and a horse who understood each other completely. When Maddie shifted her weight, Pepper moved. When Maddie looked at a calf, Pepper was already turning toward it. They worked together the way a hand works with its fingers, in coordination so seamless it appeared effortless. By noon, she had cut 23 calves. The next closest cutter had managed 15. Pruitt did not say anything, but she noticed him watching her from the branding fire with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something closer to professional respect. The trouble came from a hand named Dill Haskins, a lanky, loose-jointed cowboy in his 20s who had the unfortunate combination of limited skill and unlimited opinions. He had been watching Maddie work all morning, with an expression of increasing irritation, and during the midday break, he made his feelings known. "Ain't natural," he said, loud enough for the whole crew to hear. He was sitting on a log near the branding fire, eating biscuits from a tin. A woman on a Roundup. "What's next? We let the schoolmarm rope?" Nobody responded. The other hands looked at their plates. "I'm just saying," Dill continued, warming to his subject. "There's men's work and there's women's work, and if the line gets blurred, the whole operation goes sideways." Maddie ate her biscuit and said nothing. She had heard variations of this speech from men like Dill her entire life. Men who measured their own worth by the boundaries they drew around other people's abilities. "Dill," Pruitt said from the other side of the fire, "shut up and eat." The real test came on the third day, when a section of the herd broke through a gap in the holding pen and scattered across the flat. 30 head of cattle, cows and calves mixed together, running hard toward the ridge with the kind of panicked momentum that could carry them into rough country, where they would be lost for days. Pruitt shouted for the crew to mount up. Maddie was already in the saddle. She spun Pepper toward the gap and kicked her into a gallop, and the mare responded with the explosive acceleration that was her birthright. Flat out, ears pinned, covering ground with the desperate efficiency of an animal that understood the stakes. She reached the lead cattle in 90 seconds. She swung wide to the left, got ahead of the bunch, and turned them, not with shouting or whip cracking, but with position, putting herself and Pepper between the cattle and the ridge, and holding the line while the animals milled and bellowed, and gradually, grudgingly, began to slow. 2 other riders reached her within minutes, and together they pushed the cattle back toward the holding pen. It took an hour to resort the bunch, and when it was done, Maddie was drenched in sweat, and Pepper was blowing hard, and every man in the crew was looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with disapproval. Pruitt rode up beside her and stopped his horse. "That was good work," he said. He paused, which for Pruitt was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Your father would have been proud." The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned her face away so he would not see the shine in her eyes, and busied herself adjusting Pepper's cinch until the moment passed. That night, around the campfire, the silence that had surrounded her for 3 days finally broke. A hand named Clyde Jessup asked her where she had learned to turn a bunch like that, and she told him about riding with her father on the Laramie Range, and Clyde told a story about a roundup he had worked in Montana, where a grizzly bear walked through the branding ground and scattered everything, and someone else told a worse story about a rattlesnake in a bedroll, and before she knew it, she was part of the circle instead of outside it, and the fire was warm and the coffee was terrible, and the stars were enormous overhead. 2 words from Gage Pruitt were worth 20 from anyone else. Rowan Beckett heard about it that evening. He was waiting on the porch when the crew rode in at dusk, his walking stick in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and Pruitt gave him the report in his usual terse style. Herd broke. Sinclair turned them. No losses. Rowan looked at Maddie as she unsaddled Pepper at the corral. She was tired, dust-covered, and sore in places she would not have admitted to anyone. But she moved with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. No wasted motion, no performance, just the work. "Miss Sinclair," he called. She walked over to the porch. He was standing now, leaning on the stick, and the effort of standing was visible in the tightness around his mouth. "Pruitt says you saved 30 head today. I turned them. The crew brought them back." "That's not what Pruitt said." She looked at him, at the pain in his face, at the frustration of a cattleman who could not sit a horse, at the quiet, desperate need to believe that his operation was in capable hands while he was sidelined, and she understood something about Rowan Beckett that he had not said aloud. He was afraid, not of her, not of the Roundup, but of the possibility that the ranch he had built with his body would not survive now that his body had failed him. He needed someone he could trust to do the work he could not do, and trust, for a man like Rowan, was not given. It was earned, one day at a time, in dust and sweat and the precise, verifiable language of cattle counts and clean gathers. "I'll be here tomorrow," she said. "I know you will," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, with something underneath the certainty that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but something warmer and more personal, told her that the trial period was over. The roundup lasted 2 weeks. By the end of it, Maddie had cut more calves than any hand on the crew, 147 to the next cutter's 112. She had turned 2 more breakouts, mended 16 feet of holding pen, and earned the grudging respect of every man on the line, including Dill Haskins, who had stopped complaining after the 3rd day and started asking her quiet questions about cutting technique when he thought no one was listening. On the last evening, the crew sat around the fire and passed a bottle of whiskey, and someone started singing, and Maddie sat on a rock at the edge of the firelight and watched the sparks rise into the dark sky and felt the deep, bone-level satisfaction of work well done. Rowan was on the porch when she rode in the next morning to collect her pay. He was standing without the stick, leaning on the railing, but standing, and his face looked different, less drawn, less hollow. Something had eased in him over the 2 weeks, and she realized it was the fear. Watching his ranch function without him had not broken him. It had freed him. "Your pay," he said, handing her an envelope, "and a standing offer. When fall roundup comes, the cutting position is yours if you want it." "I want it," she said. He nodded. Then he looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him. The frank, unguarded gaze of a man who did not know how to be anything other than honest. "Maddie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Rowan. I need someone to help me run this place. Not just at Roundup, year-round. The leg isn't getting better as fast as I want, and I can't do it alone." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do my work. I'm asking you to do your own work. Here, alongside mine." She looked at the ranch, the barn, the corrals, the open range stretching toward the mountains, the cattle grazing in the distance like dark stones scattered across a green cloth. She looked at Rowan Beckett, leaning on his porch railing with his bad leg and his honest face, and his quiet, unadorned need for someone who could do what he could not. "I'll need a cabin," she said, "and Pepper gets the good stall." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him. Unguarded, warm, transforming his drawn face into something that made her chest tighten in a way she had not anticipated and was not entirely prepared for. "The good stall," he said. "Done." She turned Pepper toward the barn, and the morning sun was warm on her back, and the range was wide and green and waiting, and somewhere behind her, Rowan Beckett was watching her ride away with an expression she did not see but could feel, steady and certain, and full of something that neither of them had named yet, but both of them knew was there, growing quietly, the way grass grows after rain.